Hello, everybody. Welcome to the morning show, broadcasting on Channel 9 and WJOP LP Newburyport, FM 96.3. We'll also be available after broadcast on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted and honored to welcome today's guests, William Schulz and Sushma Raman. They are co-authors of the new book from Harvard University Press, The Coming Good Society: Why New Realities Demand New Rights. And let me tell you a little bit about their very accomplished and distinguished backgrounds in this field. William Schulz is Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy and a former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. He was also Executive Director of Amnesty International USA from 1994 until 2006. Sushma Raman is Executive Director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center. She was a program officer with the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Foundation, focused on human rights, philanthropic collaboratives, and social justice initiatives. Bill and Sushma, welcome, and thank you, both of you, so much for taking the time to visit the morning show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Mary. Delightful to be here.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year.
My pleasure. Yes, Happy New Year to everybody. Well, Bill and Sushma, to begin with, you've both dedicated your professional lives to studying and advocating for human rights. And I'm always fascinated by how our professional destinies find us, or sometimes we stumble into them. It can work both ways. So I wanted to start with each of you briefly describing how your commitment to working in the field of human rights was forged.
Sushma, why don't you take that?
Wonderful. Thank you again, Mary. So I was born and raised in India. And at the time, I think my commitment to social justice and human rights emerged observing the status of refugees from Tibet and Bangladesh, the status of women and girls, the issues of peace and regional security. So it was very nascent and emerging. And I came to college in the United States, and it was at a time where I got immersed in student organizing around issues of human rights in Central America, apartheid in South Africa, as well as issues of poverty in the United States. And I basically dedicated my entire career to the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, and now academia, really thinking about how can we each make a small contribution to making the world a better and more just place.
Excellent. So it sounds like you were immersed in a lot of different areas, really from the very beginning. Thank you, Sushma. How about you, Bill?
Well, in retrospect, Mary, my human rights commitment began in high school because I went to an all-male, very traditional prep school where hazing was a very common phenomenon, and I grew to hate bullies. And over the years, I recognized that much of my passion, or some of my passion, for protecting the underdog and those who were at risk of persecution arose from that very personal experience. But of course, I was a child of the 60s, so the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement, these were very formative for me. And as a Unitarian Universalist minister, the worth and dignity of every person is central to Unitarian Universalist religious faith. And so, as you mentioned, I eventually became president of the denomination. And that was really at the heart of my devotion to human rights when I became executive director of Amnesty International USA.
Well, thank you for that, Bill. And I have to say, you certainly put your experience and aversion to bullying to good use over the course of your life. So I'm glad to hear it served a noble purpose. Well, thank you both for that. I wanted to ask you next, your book has a very hopeful title. The Coming Good Society just brightens my heart a little bit every time I see it or say it aloud. And I wonder what made each of you decide that the time was right for a book on this topic.
So, it's been approximately 70 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we've seen major progress in the world on a number of fronts. We've seen countries adopt legislation to protect women and girls. We've seen movements around environmental justice, economic justice, labor, and so on. So we've seen great progress, and we've also seen setbacks and rollbacks. And very often, human rights organizations and leaders are mired in the present crisis. We are often focused on the current authoritarian ruler or the violation of human rights at various levels. And our thinking was really, what are the issues that are on the horizon that we need to be aware of and that we need to work to addressing in order to ensure that we build a good society. And, we don't necessarily have a crystal ball. We can predict all of the issues and all of the concerns and all of the approaches, but our book really aims to address what are some elements of a good society, what are the capabilities that each of us needs to address, drawing on the work of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, amongst others. And what are some of these issues around, for example, the rights of nature, or issues around the use of technology in the public sphere and how it affects rights. So this was our aim, to really encourage people to think, dialogue, collaborate, and envision new possibilities.
Well, and one of the things that I really enjoyed and appreciated about your book was the way that I felt like my mind was expanding as you were talking about issues that are currently arising, and anticipating some of the challenges about human rights that will arise. And we'll be getting to some of those in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to ask you, one of the through lines in your book is the point you make that human rights are not now and never have been either fixed or static. They change with history, they expand and contract with us. And you also point out that this can be seen by some people as a controversial point of view that you're making. So for anyone who might see it that way, I hope that you might illustrate this point with an example or two of ways or places that human rights have done both, where you've seen them expand, and in tandem with that, places where you've seen them contract.
So let me give you two quick examples within most of our lifetimes of the expansion of rights. One is in the area of disability rights. It was not until 2008, which is not very long ago, that the International Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons was finally ratified and came into effect. That sounds surprising to us today that it was so recent, because rights of disabled persons are almost second nature to us now. But that's in fact a relatively recent development. Another example that hasn't yet been firmly established at the international level, but is emerging, is, of course, the right to marriage equality, the right of same-sex marriage. Again, it was 2001 when the Netherlands became the first country in the world to recognize a right to same-sex marriage. That's 20 years ago, not very long ago. Yeah. And that is emerging as it's been legalized here in the United States and around the world, and it is emerging as a new right. Now, in terms of regression, one of the fortunate things is that in general, rights tend to be progressive rather than regressive. There are certainly lots of threats to rights. And I'll give you an example. Certainly the so-called war on terror resulted in several threats to rights that had been well established, such as the right not to be tortured or the right to due process. And there were certainly those who argued that those rights were too liberal, were too widely expanded already, and shouldn't be expanded anymore, or really should contract. Fortunately, the international community didn't agree with that, and those norms, those standards, are still well established, but we have to fight hard to protect them at every moment.
Oh, those are terrific examples, Bill. Thank you for that. It is so easy, I think, sometimes to forget how recently certain rights, you give the excellent example of disability rights, how, those are widely accepted currently, but it is, I have to say, somewhat shocking to me to think that it was only 2008, which you're right, is not that long ago. So it's helpful to remember and cherish, I think, recent rights so that we don't take them for granted. So thank you for those great examples. Well, one of the other things that you talk about in the book is a common assumption that some people make, that human rights are somehow innate to us, inside us, rather akin to an organ or an appendage that we enter life with simply by virtue of being human. And to me, I guess this seems analogous to the way some people see each individual as participating in a soul or a divine spark or light that's intrinsic to human rights and to human life, and perhaps bring those rights with it. But your frame differs from that. You talk about human rights as transactional, and I wondered if you could clarify what you mean by transactional, and what are the implications of the transactional lens for how we approach human rights?
So our conviction is that human rights are not something magically inside us. They're not like a conception of a soul, for example. Mm-hmm. We believe that human rights are the way human beings define how we want to relate to other human beings and to the larger world around us. They take place in that space of transaction between us and one another and us and the larger world. And they define what a good society ought to look like based upon our conceptions of dignity and flourishing. And the implications for rights of this conception are that, first of all, rights are not static, as we've just said in response to your previous question. They change, they can change, they inevitably will change, and we ought to help shape that change. But secondly, the implication is that rights are not just about human beings. If rights describe our relationship in the transaction between us and the world around us, then there may be certain other entities that we want to assign rights to because our relationship with them will be part and parcel of our conception of the good society. And among those entities that we describe in the book, we can talk about more later, but among them are animals, maybe even robots, and nature or the ecosystem itself.
So it's a powerful lens, in other words. In a couple of ways, it strikes me as you describe it. It puts the responsibility on us for determining what kinds of transactions we want to have, and making sure that we're always conscientious and conscious of the rights that we are expanding or contracting. And it's also malleable in that if it's transactional, it can include other things than human beings. And we will return to that later, because that's one of the fascinating and mind-expanding things about your book that I want to get back to. So thank you for that, Bill. Let me just draw upon that a little bit more. If rights are transactional, evolving with us and sometimes devolving, I wonder if we'll always be in the position then of there being a tension between people who envision the need for new rights to go along with new realities and people who think, well, we already have enough rights. And maybe we have too many rights, or we're extending them to people who don't really need or deserve them. Just for an example that came to my mind as I was reading your book, after the Civil War, citizenship and the right to vote were expanded to include African-American men, but was still denied to women. The right to vote, in fact, was extended a scant 100 years ago to women, and certainly women's suffrage is far from a universally accepted right. I think what I'm really asking you about is, what is the life cycle of a human right? And will this tension always be there? By what force or power does a right emerge from this tension to gain global acceptance, or to be ordained as a right by enough people to become a defining quality of a good society?
Thanks, Mary. That's a pretty big question. So I'll start with your first point, which is about that tension between those who envision the need for new rights and those who think that we might have enough rights, or perhaps even too many rights. And in fact, in the US, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had set up a commission on unalienable rights, which really wanted to look at this and sort of really circumscribe the set of rights. So I think that very often the folks who are advocating for fewer rights, because we have enough rights already, are really not interested in rights. They're really interested in protecting their own power base and authority, and will often say, well, we got to focus on the existing issues which haven't been addressed. But very often that they're not going to do that. And so, we really argue that rights are not a zero-sum game, that you can protect the rights of women, for example, and be concerned about people with disabilities. You can really think about both. It's not a zero-sum game where you have to pit specific groups against others. There are some cases where you may want to think about, for example, my freedom of movement or my right to free speech versus freedom of religion, et cetera. But in most cases, when we're talking about rights of disenfranchised communities, it's really not a question of, is this right needed or not? And people who raise that, we have to question that. In terms of a life cycle of a right, my perspective is that, that we must always be vigilant. You do need a critical mass of support for a right to be emerged and be seen as a part of a good society. That could come through norms change from people on the ground who are mobilizing, or it could come through legislative or policy action or universal efforts like the UDHR or international conventions and covenants that occur. But you do need a critical mass of support. But once you have that, you still need to remain vigilant, because the reality is to implement those to ensure equal access and opportunity, you need to always be vigilant. So, even in the United States, we are very, very far from ensuring the realization of rights for, women, for example, or LGBT communities, or, immigrants who are over the last several years have been treated with shocking cruelty on the border. So I think that, while we may think of a life cycle, we also want to ensure that we don't then get complacent and assume that these issues have been discussed for decades or centuries and we can move on to other topics. So, we need to ensure compliance with the current kind of framework, but then we also need to expand to think about the new issues on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very helpful, Sushma. And what stands out to me from what you're saying is, in fact, the need for eternal vigilance. That you can keep pushing the boundaries, but you can't assume that those boundaries will remain as far pushed out as you want them, unless you keep your eye on, what's happening in the present. There might be forces at work, those intentions, in other words, which may be as eternal as the need for vigilance, may constantly be trying to push them back. So you just have to keep your eye on the ball, so to speak. Thanks, that's really helpful. I appreciate that.
But I will add that, that has been the focus of the human rights movement. And so our book says that's incredibly important. So you need to do that, but you also need to keep your eye on the horizon to see what are these changes that are upon us and how do we best prepare for them.
Well, and let's shift to some of those dawning horizons, so to speak. And it's great, another great illustration of your point that rights are continually evolving, because you discuss in the book some pending possible new rights in response to emerging realities for us to consider. And they reminded me of various science fiction films, from AI to Her to Minority Report, a good reminder that science fiction can often be absolutely prophetic. And the benefit of contemplating these brave new realities that you postulated is that we can begin to discern what composes a coming good society among those possible rights and which might not. You offer some challenging scenarios in three areas: artificial intelligence, what I guess I'd call gender fluidity, and animal rights. And I hope that you might be willing to discuss an example from each of those domains where new rights are pushing the boundaries of how we conceive of human rights, even now as we speak. Maybe we could start with artificial intelligence. Maybe an example there?
So clearly this is a controversial area, and we in our book are not making predictions, but we're raising questions about whether eventually some kinds of robotic intelligences or robots, social robots, will be entities in which we want to invest or to which we want to assign rights. And the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, the emerging deep learning neural networks, which are allowing robots to become more and more complex and intelligent, mean that at some point they may well even emerge in their own autonomy beyond that of their creators or programmers. And at that point, we will be challenged to say whether or not they deserve the assignment of rights, or they may even demand the assignment of rights. But another way to look at this is, what does a refusal to respect certain types of social robots say about us as human beings? There was a very interesting experiment conducted by a scientist named Kate Darling, who gave a group of people small toys. They were small robotic toys in the shape of dinosaurs, small little dinosaurs like our children would play with. And after the people in the group had played with them for a while, the scientist asked them to destroy those robots, and they couldn't do it. They didn't want to do it. Some of them started to cry. And why didn't they want to do it? They didn't want to do it because they knew that on some level, when we establish an emotional tie to another creation, and then wantonly destroy it capriciously without any particular reason, we may do damage to ourselves. We may increase our own commitment or our own likelihood of committing cruel acts. Yeah. So that's one area in the area of AI, which is far from established yet, but which we at least need to think about or will need to think about in the coming years. You've mentioned other areas, Mary. Do you want me to speak about?
Yes, there was gender and animal rights as well.
Yeah, so gender rights, I think, are far less speculative than robots' rights. I think it is well established now that gender is not strictly binary, that it is, as you've said, quite fluid. And what that means is that those rights, which were based solely on a binary understanding of gender, need to evolve. No one is saying, for example, that women's rights ought to be eliminated. Far from that. But it is to say that as our understanding of gender as fluid and non-binary evolves, then new rights may need to evolve. So one example is the right to transition from one gender to another. We know that this is happening. We know about transgender persons. Transgender persons are well established in the world and in the news. And yet there is no internationally recognized right to transition. Well, that's the type of right in the area of gender fluidity that I think will probably evolve over the next few years or decades until it seems to us, again, second nature, just as some of the well-established rights do now in other areas.
Yeah, that seems like we can see it in process right now, Bill, yes, with what's happening currently. And what about animal rights?
So animal rights are very interesting because, of course, animals can experience pain. Animals have all sorts of qualities which are analogous to human qualities, and yet they are not yet established as rights holders. There are certainly laws that prevent cruelty to animals, but they aren't rights. Animals themselves have not been assigned rights. So there's a very interesting movement led by a creative attorney named Stephen Wise and the Non-Human Rights Project, which is attempting to establish legally the rights of animals to habeas corpus, for example. And so suits have been brought on behalf of animals who are imprisoned in private zoos and are being mistreated. And Wise is trying to establish in court, he hasn't yet been successful, but he's still working on it, that an animal who is being mistreated and detained in that way ought to have the right to habeas corpus. That is the right to go to a court and ask for release from arbitrary detention or release from detention. So that's an example, and there are many others, but that's an example of the types of animal rights that may well be evolving in the decades ahead.
Those are wonderful. And as I mentioned before, mind expanding examples, Bill. I really appreciate that. I think that as there's constant research going on about animals' intelligence and emotions that shows that they have much more in common with us than we like to think. And I think that is an actively evolving field. And I'm going to have to look up and learn more about Stephen Wise's project. That sounds very exciting. So, well, thank you for that. I wanted to talk to you a little bit, Sushma, now about your observations in the book. You talked earlier about growing up in India, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book is your observations about the impact of corruption in India. And of course, corruption is universal. There's corruption everywhere. Everybody participates in it. But you focus on the disproportionate impact that corruption has on people who are already disadvantaged and vulnerable. And you outlined, in fact, I was interested in the kind of a typology of corruption from petty, grand, political, and global. And you discuss these as violations of human rights, and suggesting that we conceive of and advocate for, and I love this, a right to live free from corruption. So I was hoping that you could talk about how this right might be established and what impact it would have on poor and disadvantaged people, as well as everybody else.
Thank you so much, Mary. So as you said, corruption is something that's universal. It's not actually limited to the countries of the global South. You see it very much in the US as well. Every country has to deal with this issue. So, very often people might think of corruption as a financial or economic problem, where there's a loss to the gross domestic product of a country, but they don't think about it as a violation of human rights. Or you might think about it even through a public health lens, for example, where perhaps money that is siphoned away from a country's health system, or you might think about it, in various lenses, but the human rights lens is a more recent lens that has been brought to this topic. And we believe that corruption is connected to human rights in at least 4 different ways. The first is that corruption actually affects the poor far more than the rich. It limits the ability of the poor to exercise their full range of economic and political rights and to realize their full human dignity. So if you think about it, if you are a poor person in a country where you have to pay a bribe just to be able to ensure that your stall on the side of the street remains, or you have to pay a bribe to the headmaster of a school so that your child is admitted to a public school, or to a doctor, in a free health clinic. So these are the kinds of things where there's a toll or a tax on the poor, and a far more of their disposable income goes to navigate basic goods and services that others take for granted. Second, it really hinders the ability of the state to garner revenues, which could have been spent on the provision of public goods and services, and that really affects the poor more so than the rich. The sources of illicit money are often tied to illicit activities, not always, but very often activities such as labor trafficking or narco trafficking, are tied to corruption. And finally, and probably the most importantly, the design of institutions, laws, and policies become affected because of corruption, and these tend to then benefit the powerful and the wealthy at the expense of the poor. And this is why it's so important to think about corruption through a human rights lens. Now, what does that practically mean? We don't currently have this right, but should there be such an international right, then what you could imagine is that local civil society organizations, social movements, advocacy groups could really think about how do they work together to draw inspiration from this international right, and also think about how to coordinate with international bodies such as the UN, or there might be some sort of international anti-corruption court. And they could think about how to coordinate with people in other countries, thinking about the way the global human rights movement has provided support and opportunities for collaboration beyond national borders. So there are ways in which this could be very, very powerful for organizations and movements to ensure accountability, not just through this financial lens, but really centering those who are poor and disadvantaged. In the human rights movement, we think about rights in different sort of generations. The first generation is the political civil rights, second generation is economic, social, cultural rights, and third generation, these solidarity rights like environmental issues. And so, thinking of corruption within this framework, it would really affect all rights, but thinking of it within the context of solidarity rights would ensure that people who are poor would be able to live a better life and be able to, realize the capabilities that would allow them to flourish.
Absolutely, and you make a powerful case for it, and it certainly would be part of a good society, it strikes me, and we would all benefit from it because it would make for a fairer, more just place, and we all benefit from that in every possible level, morally, in terms of justice, in terms of fairness, just in terms of how positive we can feel about the world we live in and whether our society is good. So thank you for that, Sushma. That was really compelling. I wanted to go back to an idea that you were talking about, Bill, in terms of the transactional lens, giving us the option of thinking about entities other than sentient beings. I was so interested in the concept of nature having rights. And so I would like to go back to that, to the idea that perhaps Mother Nature, the Earth, the biosphere, has the right to exist for its own sake, without plunder or exploitation by our single but spectacularly often exploitive species. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how this right would be conceived, not just as a conservation issue, because often conservation issues are still very human-centric. You want sustainable environments for human beings, but as a right that nature has actually for its own sake. How do we think about that? How do we work toward that? What's that lens look like?
Well, interestingly enough, this has already been established in other parts of the world. Bolivia, for example, includes the rights of what it calls Pachamama, or the Mother Earth, in its constitution. And in New Zealand, the rights of an indigenous, a river in indigenous land has been recognized as being able to claim rights. The issue here, it really is what you just said, Mary. Of course, we already have laws that protect parts of the natural world from our own toxins and pollution and so on. But we do this because it's good for us, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But does that mean that when we and human interests aren't directly implicated, that it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the world around us? I think that if we think of rights as having to do with a concept of dignity and of flourishing, and we ask ourselves, when we see a polluted river, when we see strip mining of a mountain, when we see any of these desecrations of the natural world, do they not on some level represent a destruction of the dignity of the earth around us? And if that's the case, may we not want to say that part of our relationship to those entities, to the natural world and the ecosystems of which we are a part, need to be characterized by an affirmation of that dignity in the form of rights, in the form of granting nature and ecosystems rights. And what this means in practical terms is that then people can litigate on behalf of the rights of those entities. Just, the fact that a mountain can't go into court and dress in a suit and litigate that's no different than a baby who can't go into court. But nonetheless, we may want to litigate on behalf of that baby. And so we may well be able to litigate or want to litigate in the future on behalf of nature and various elements within nature.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. As you talk about that, Bill, it makes me think of the story you were telling before about the research done on the dinosaur babies' toys, and yes. It affected people's hearts when they were destroyed. Well, anybody who's ever seen a picture of a land that's been strip mined, it just breaks your heart. It just kind of goes right at you, because we are, of course, part of nature, and nature is the source of us. And so honestly, I frankly love the idea of somebody being able to go into court and advocate on behalf of nature for its own sake. So thank you for that. Those are great examples. I wanted to ask both of you about a right that I've been thinking of, and I don't know whether it has any possibility, but I want to get your perspective on it. For the last number of years, I've been thinking about what the prospects might be for a right to truth from government officials and from organizations that bill themselves as presenting news. Now, I recognize the difficulty of defining what the truth is. I'm not unrealistic about that, but there are plenty of examples of deliberate misinformation. It's not that people are confused about what the truth is, but they just make stuff up or deliberately lying about things. And it strikes me that we feel entitled to the truth from many professionals, from doctors, from accountants, from engineers, from contractors. And of course, when you go to court, you take an oath to tell the truth. And if you perjure yourself, in that context, it's a crime. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe I'm wondering about the possibility of extending this idea of taking an oath to tell the truth to the domain of if you are an elected official. Anyway, do you think this has any possible traction?
A very interesting question, and of course, very germane to our current political context. I guess what I'd say, and then I'd be interested in Sushma's reaction, is that this really turns on this question of freedom of speech. And it's quite interesting that, of course, in Europe, there are certain speech affirmations that are not protected, specifically with regard to the denial of the Holocaust, for example, or with regard to certain kind of insults, to hate speech with regard to certain groups. Those are not protected in Europe. They are protected for the most part. They are protected here in the United States. We have a much more expansive understanding of the right to free speech. But what this means, given that, of course, Europe is often cited as a real champion, a progressive champion of rights, what this means is that these things are in tension. You're asking essentially, is there a right to lie? Do politicians have a right to lie? And the fact is that generally in jurisprudence in the US, the answer is yes. And in Europe, within certain restraints, the answer may be no. And so this is an important tension that needs to be explored further.
Well, I'm glad to get the affirmation that it's a worthy tension to explore and to look at, because you know, and you're right, it's very timely. Every day in the news, we see examples. But I was just thinking about how many professions are expected to tell the truth. And one of the most responsible professions is being an elected official. So anyway, we'll keep thinking on it. Well, now I wanted to go back. I know that you said you didn't have Sushma, you said you didn't have a crystal ball earlier, but nonetheless, I want to imagine that you might have one and forecast, perhaps, if you're willing, which of the newly evolving possible rights that you talk about in your book do you see possibly emerging into consensus in the near future?
Terrific. There's so many issues on the horizon, but I think from my perspective, I would actually go back to a right that is already codified in over 150 constitutions around the world and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we need to revisit it with a new lens, and that is the right to privacy. So there are many people who might think of the right to privacy as a bit of a luxury or a non-necessity, but in reality, the right to privacy is really, really fundamental, and it's under threat from two different sources. First is the increasing use of surveillance by governments, surveillance technology to track our everywhere, you know, movements, our activities, our associations, and so on. And this is really heightened in the post 9/11 environment. And the second is the commodification of our data by corporations, and then the intersection of the two, of course. And so, you know, around the world, we're seeing the ramifications of this, whether it's the use of a social credit score in China, where every citizen is gotten a score based on everything that they do that is monitored, to the surveillance on the US-Mexico border of, you know, people fleeing violence in Central America, to even the tracking of people participating in protests for Black Lives Matter. And so I do think that people around the world are concerned about this, and add to that the tracking of our data by social media companies and other companies. So this really affects a range of people. And I think in the United States even, there is bipartisan interest in this issue around surveillance technology. And I do think that there is potential there for people coming together to really think about how to strengthen the right to privacy in this era of technology. And a couple of examples, you know, thinking about the concept of algorithmic justice, because increasingly algorithms are being used to make determinations. For example, Is this person applying for asylum in this country? Are they a national security threat or a terrorist, or should they be admitted? Those algorithms are opaque and are often based on data that is historic in nature. Similarly, sentencing decisions or parole decisions in the US criminal justice system, decisions about humanitarian aid. And so I think there is going to be some sort of requirement of transparency around the ways in which these algorithms are developed and constructed and deployed. Another is the right to be forgotten, which is really thinking about, your record that lives on the internet and how to erase that in the future. But then you might also want to think about how do you use technology to empower disenfranchised communities, and the right to record is emerging as something that people are using in the face of police violence and abuse to be able to document these instances and to corroborate what is happening on the ground, to contest what the police are saying.
Yeah.
So I think this is a space where we have to watch what is emerging, and there's going to be significant momentum. And because it affects people of all political persuasions and income levels and races, I do think there's potential for coming together around strengthening this right.
Thank you, Sushma. Those are all excellent and very much living examples of how our definition of the good society is forming itself as we speak. Bill, how about you? You have a crystal ball?
Well, I'll just mention one area of rights that we haven't talked about, but which is critically important, and that is the whole area of control of our genes and of gene editing.
Oh, yeah.
And this is an emerging area. It can be used for tremendous good when it is used, for example, to combat various kinds of diseases, but it can also potentially be used for enormous harm. What kind of future generation do we want to design? And this is going to require a whole new conception of rights around sovereignty, around personal sovereignty, around control of our genes, who owns our genes. Yeah. All of this is an emerging area of rights that is far from resolved at this point, but will need to be addressed sooner rather than later.
Well, and your book is a wonderful resource for anybody who is interested in understanding more about the challenges that are confronting us right now, and will continue to confront us and challenge us with the question, what does it mean to live in a good society, and what rights are part of that? So thank you both for coming to the morning show. I've just been fascinated by everything you've had to say. I feel very lucky to have been able to interview. And I'm happy to let our listeners and watchers know that they'll have another chance to listen and interact with you. The First Religious Society Unitarian Universalist here in Newburyport is sponsoring a virtual presentation with Bill and Sushma on January 12th from 7 to 8 p.m. And for information or to register for that, just go to their website, www.frsu.org, and scroll down till you find the information about their virtual presentation. Bill and Sushma, thank you so much. It's been an honor. I've learned so much. And as I said, your book is wonderful. Your book is also available in any bookstore or through Amazon, and I recommend it highly to anybody who's interested in these issues. So thank you both so much for visiting the morning show. It's been an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Well, that's it for today's show, everybody. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 for the morning show, when my guest will be Amber Hewitt. She was a candidate for the Massachusetts legislature last fall, and she's an advocate for alternative energy and for proactive strategies to address climate change. Penny Lazarus and Ryan Turner of the Newburyport Choral Society will also be here to talk about their upcoming semester. If you missed part of today's show, it will be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Just go to www.ncmhub.org, click on the YouTube icon, and then click on playlist. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just click on the cloud icon at www.ncmhub.org and scroll down. That's it for today, everybody. Bye, Bill. Bye, Sushma. Thank you again. It was wonderful to talk to you, and thank you for the work you've done and for your book. Bye, everybody.